Cool. Hello, everybody. How are you guys all doing today? Good? Oh, I am so excited to be here. So my name is Robyn Jackson, and I'm the owner of a business called Cheese from Scratch, a business that teaches homesteaders around the world how to turn their milk into cheese. I'm just wondering, just how will I flip the slides? Will you do that for me? Okay, perfect. Sounds good. So I'm here all the way from British Columbia, Canada. Back in Canada, my husband Zach and I have 3 young children, and we own and operate a 250-head beef cattle ranch. So Zach and I have always been really invested in growing our own food. We work to grow a garden, put up most of our own meat, and we also keep a few milk cows with the primary purpose of making that milk into all sorts of different cheeses. Sorry. So before we had milk cows on our homestead, dairy was sort of that missing link in our quest to be a little bit more self-sufficient. It was milk that had us going to the grocery store every single week, whether it was for cheese or dairy products. So bringing milk cows onto our homestead really helped us to bring food a little bit closer to home and learning how to process all of that dairy into cheese. A few years ago, I decided to turn my passion of cheesemaking into a business with the primary goal of not only teaching homesteaders how to make cheese, but also teaching them how to fit cheesemaking into their life. We can switch. Thank you. So as homesteaders, cheesemaking should not take over our life, but it should fit into it. So I hope in my presentation today, as well as my demonstration tomorrow, that I give you guys a few tips and tricks to kind of help you work this skill into your homestead life and make it just one of the things that you are able to do on your homestead. So in today's presentation, we're going to be looking at the origin of cheese, not in a historical perspective, but in a natural perspective, because cheesemaking really is a natural process. So we're going to be diving into that. We're going to be deep diving into the ingredients used in cheesemaking. I remember when I first learned how to make cheese, sourcing ingredients was kind of one of the things that sort of stopped me from starting. So we're going to be looking at that. I'm also going to be teaching you guys how to keep something called a Clabber culture. So I keep a raw milk starter culture on my counter. I feed it every day how you might feed a sourdough starter, and I use it as a starter culture for all of the different cheeses that I make. So I'm going to be demonstrating to you guys how to keep that going today, and then we're going to end this presentation with what I like to call the master curd demo. So all of the different cheeses that I make, they start with the same 4 steps. And so in today's presentation, I'm going to be showing you those first 4 steps, and then tomorrow I'm going to be back, and I'm going to be showing you what happens after you have those steps. What happens and how do you make all of those different cheeses. All right, so we can flip there. I do have to apologize. I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm sorry. All right, so milk actually wants to become cheese. It's meant to become cheese. In nature, young ruminants, whether that's calves or goat kids or lambs, they depend on cheesemaking for their survival. I like to use the example of a little calf. A little calf drinks the milk from its mother's udder. That milk is warm, and it goes into that little calf's stomach where it's also warm. It's acidic. There are enzymes there. We know these enzymes as rennet. And all of these things combine to cause that milk to go from liquid to solid, to cheese. If that little calf was not able to turn its mother's milk into cheese, it would not be able to fully, properly digest all of the nutrients that that milk has to offer. It would just kind of shoot right through them. So that calf does depend on cheesemaking for its survival. And as cheesemakers, the closer we can kind of follow this natural process, the easier our cheesemaking becomes. And I like to use the example of that master curd demo that we are going to do at the end of this presentation, because it actually mimics calf digestion. The first thing we are doing is we're warming our milk up to a certain temperature that's really close to how the milk actually comes out of the udder. The second thing we are doing is we are creating an acidic environment using fermentation. And then we're adding an enzyme into that milk called rennet, the very same enzyme that actually lives in the lining of that little calf's stomach. And all of these things are combining to cause that milk to turn to cheese. So kind of understanding this just helps me to troubleshoot a little bit better and just helps me when things are kind of not going as well. All right. So the ingredients used in cheesemaking, there are so many amazing things about cheese, but one of the most amazing things is that there are thousands of different cheeses in the world, and they are all basically made from the same 4 ingredients of milk, bacterial culture, rennet, and salt. So we're going to be diving into how to source these ingredients and a little bit about each one. So before we get started, I just want to do a little show of hands. Who here in the audience has a dairy animal at home? Okay, quite a few of you. Who here is hoping to sometime in the future have a dairy animal on their homestead? Okay, so probably most of you guys are looking at that route. So as homesteaders with dairy animals, we are at a really huge advantage because our cheese making actually gets to start in the barn. It gets to start with the animals that we buy, the breeds that we buy, the way that we treat these animals, and the things that we feed these animals. All of these have really big impacts on the cheese that we're able to make with that milk. All right, so milk is a product comprised primarily of water. It's about 87.5% water, which means that the other 12.5% is comprised of proteins and butterfat and lactose and minerals. Raw milk also has this extra component in that it is a living ecology, meaning that it is filled with all sorts of different bacteria and yeasts that also like to feed on the milk. Now, when we look at the proteins in milk, there's basically two head categories of proteins. And the first head category is called casein proteins. These are the proteins that are responsible for cheese making. They're basically the Legos of cheese making, is what I like to describe them as. The second head category of proteins are whey proteins. And these are the ones that the bodybuilders know. These are the ones that are left behind in the whey after the cheese-making process. So why casein proteins is something that I like to talk about in front of homesteaders specifically is because different cows can have different types of proteins in their milk. We all know that from the A1 and A2 kind of thing. But there's a specific type of protein that we really like with cheese making, and that's a protein called kappa casein. Kappa casein is responsible for yield as well as how quickly your milk coagulates in cheese making. And so different cows, all cows have kappa casein, but different cows will have different genotypes of kappa casein. And the very best genotype for making cheese is a variety called kappa casein BB. And this is a variety that we can choose to buy in our cows. So you can look for a cow that has this protein type. Or you can also choose to breed your future cows with this protein in mind. So if you're looking to have a future heifer that would have this variety. There's other things that also influence how quickly and how much yield you're going to get in your cheese making. So all of these things can be diet, they can be breed related, they can be different season, and they can also be lactation stage. So milk isn't the same throughout a cow's entire lactation. And this is something really interesting for us to know as homesteaders because we are often only milking one or two animals, and so we're going to see this uniqueness in the milk. A couple examples of how milk is not the same throughout a cow's entire lactation would be when your cow first calves. So the very first product that a cow produces when she calves is colostrum. Now, colostrum actually isn't meant to coagulate. It's meant to stay liquid so that that calf can actually digest those whole antibodies from its mother's milk. So a lot of times on the homestead, we are starting to drink our cow's milk at like 4 or 5 days after they freshen. But we actually shouldn't be using that milk for cheese making until at least 1 week postpartum. And every single time that I have tried to make cheese with milk that is from a cow that has freshened too early, I always have troubles. I always have difficulties getting that milk to coagulate. I always have contamination problems. So that's just a general rule that I have, that I always wait that 1 week. Another example of how lactation stage can influence milk is something called late lactation. So late lactation actually refers more to how close your cow is to her next calving versus how long she's actually been in lactation. So as cows approach their next calving, their priorities sort of start to change, and this is just taking it right back to that natural process. So that cow's priorities start to change from feeding that calf that's beside them to feeding the calf that's within them. So one of the things that you might start to see, especially because we're usually drying our cows up at like 2 months before they calve, so in that 3rd month, right before you're going to be drying them up, you might start having some issues with coagulation. And the reason for this is that cows are amazing. They grow their calves 70% of their total birth weight in that last 3 months. But this is a huge energy task, and it takes a lot of the mineral calcium. And calcium actually plays a huge role in getting milk to coagulate. So sometimes you are going to have issues with getting late lactation milk to coagulate because they're just diverting all that calcium to that growing calf. All right. So I have several rules for sourcing milk for cheese making. And these, some of these are hard and fast rules. Some of these are a little bit more lenient. The first kind of one is a hard and fast one. It should always be coming from a healthy animal. And in fact, every time that I'm troubleshooting cheese making, so if I'm having a problem in my cheese making, the first spot I'm going to go back to troubleshoot is to the health of that animal, to make sure that I'm going to be doing a CMT test, which is a test that cow-side test that you can do to make sure that your cow doesn't have mastitis. So that's kind of my starting point anytime I'm troubleshooting, and the health of the animal really does make a big difference in the cheese you're able to make. The second rule that I should have is that it should always be handled appropriately. So from cow to strainer to cheese pot, you're wanting to make sure that you're handling that milk with clean techniques and making sure that you're limiting the time that bacteria that's within it, because raw milk is that living ecology, you're limiting the time that bacteria can start to grow and foster. Sorry, my third one on here is I don't make aged cheese with milk that is older than 2 days. And so this is a rule that is going to hang a lot of you up, especially if you are sourcing milk off of the farm. A lot of us are not able to make cheese with milk that is that fresh. And so I say to that, I used to make cheese with milk that was about 3 or 4 days old, and I still made a lot of good cheese. But looking back to those days, I probably had about a 10% contamination or over-fermentation rate, where I was having to toss that cheese out to the chickens. Now that I make cheese with milk that's no older than 2 days, I am probably having maybe a 1% contamination rate, so it really has made a huge difference in the cheeses that I'm able to make. And just like I talked about, because raw milk is a living ecology, just because we take it and we put it in the fridge doesn't mean that it actually stops living. It's still feeding those bacteria and yeasts and everything that is within it. And those bacteria, they actually like to feed on the same food that our cheese-making starter cultures like to feed on. So when you put your starter culture in there, not only is there less food, but there's also more competition. So you're going to have more contamination, you're going to have more over-fermentation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that further on in the presentation. Another reason I like to use fresh milk for cheese making is because it hasn't actually cream lined. I don't know if anyone, when I came up on here, I shook this milk because there was a cream line on here. So anyone that knows raw milk knows that it cream lines up, and you can stir it or you can shake it and it will kind of reincorporate back in. But once that process has happened where it has separated once, it's really hard to actually get it to fully incorporate back in. And we can stir it and we can shake it and it looks like it's back in, but later on when you go to make cheese with that milk, you're going to notice that there's a ton of cream left behind in the way. You are still going to be able to sweep some of it up. So if you aren't able to make cheese with milk that hasn't cream lined, still go ahead and shake it up or stir it up and use it. But you will notice that cream scum on the way. And one way that you can get that cream back is to just allow your pot of whey to sit afterwards, about 12 hours, and then you can go ahead and scoop it off, and that's some cultured cream for you. Let's see here. So if you don't have a dairy animal, I am very jealous because I'm from Canada. We don't actually have this website, but you guys have an awesome website. It's called realmilk.com. They have a map on there, and they help to link consumers with farmers. So if you are sourcing milk from off of the farm, you just want to make sure that you're asking these questions that we kind of talked about here. Like, what is the health of your animal? What is your milk handling practices? Because those are things that are going to have really big impacts not only your family's health and safety, but also on your cheese that you're able to make with that milk. All right, and then on the bottom here, so I never want to stop anybody from starting where they're at, because I think that is awesome. I think that if you don't have a dairy animal, you should be starting to play around with milk and start to make certain cheeses and stuff. But I also always kind of want to give that caution that with cheese making, there is always an element of failure. You know, if you have a dairy animal, it's a little bit easier to chalk that failure up as a learning experience. But if you're paying, I know there's some people that pay like $20 a gallon for a gallon of raw milk. If you are making a 4-gallon batch of cheese and then it contaminates, that's something that's devastating. That's something that's going to stop you from wanting to make cheese in the future. So just kind of maybe starting with some cheeses that take less milk, starting with some fresh dairy products are really great places to start if you are sourcing milk off of the homestead. Probably one of my favorite cheeses that I tell people to start with is feta cheese, because it takes about a gallon. You can make a good sized batch of cheese with a gallon of milk for feta. All right. And then just a little note on pasteurized and ultra-pasteurized milk. So there are lots of people that can't source or don't want to source raw milk, and there's lots of teachers out there that actually teach with pasteurized milk. Some of my favorites are Gavin Weber on YouTube, Cheese52 on YouTube, all of the different cheese supply websites. For example, New England Cheesemaking Company, they have recipes that are used for pasteurized milk. So those are really reputable sources to look if you are using pasteurized milk. There's one extra ingredient that you're going to need to add if you are using pasteurized milk, which is calcium chloride. And as we talked about with that late lactation milk where that cow is diverting all the calcium to her calf, calcium does play a big role in having milk coagulate. And during the pasteurization process, that calcium is actually damaged. So we need to add calcium chloride back into the milk before we add in our rennet to achieve coagulation. And so this is just another example of every time you take a step away from what raw milk is meant to do, what raw milk actually wants to do, you kind of have to take a step back to get it to its original form. And then the last little thing on here is ultra-pasteurized milk. So we won't spend much time on there because you can't actually make cheese with ultra-pasteurized milk. It won't coagulate. It's been damaged too far. All right. So cheesemaking is our ability to preserve our milk on our homestead. And one of the best ways to preserve anything is fermentation. So cheesemaking is actually fermentation, and there's several different stages of fermentation that you do see in cheesemaking. The first stage is something called bacterial fermentation, and this is during the making stage of cheese. So the starter cultures that we are dealing with in cheesemaking are a head category of bacteria called lactic bacteria. Lactic bacteria is this giant head category of bacteria that like to feed on sugar, and lactose happens to be the sugar in milk. So we add lactic bacteria into our milk, and it starts to feed on the lactose, and as it feeds on it, it ferments it into lactic acid. This thus acidifies the milk, and it sets the stage for another stage of fermentation, which is called fungal fermentation. And this is basically the aging stage of cheesemaking. This is where funguses and other types of bacteria and yeasts, they all start to feed on the milk and further break it down into smaller pieces. Now, so much of cheesemaking is that stage setting. Has anybody here ever made like a quick type cheese with like a vinegar, a lemon juice, or anything like that? Okay, a few of you guys. So anybody that has ever made a cheese like that, those types of cheeses, instead of adding that bacteria in and allowing it to ferment the lactose into lactic acid and then thus having acidified milk, those types of cheeses actually go straight to the acidic milk part. Because the stage hasn't been set properly for those cheeses, they can actually be aged. So that's a little note on acid-ripened cheeses. One way that we are able to set the stage properly in cheesemaking is to choose the starter cultures that we use. So if you go onto a cheese supply website, you're probably going to be overwhelmed because there is a lot of starter cultures on there. You'll probably find pages and pages of them. What I like to tell people is that there's basically two head categories of those starter cultures, mesophilic and thermophilic. So mesophilic type cultures are used for cheeses that are heated at lower temperatures. These are often moister type cheeses, for example, like cheddars, Colbys, Goudas, Fettas, Bries are all going to be mesophilic type cheeses. Thermophilic type cheeses are the other category, and these are ones that are heated at higher temperatures. So these are things like any Alpine style cheese like a Parmesan or an Asiago are going to fall under that category. So you can buy a specific culture for every type of cheese you're going to make, but what I like to tell people is just go on there and buy one mesophilic and one thermophilic culture, and use these to make all of the different cheeses that you're going to make. As you advance in your cheese making, you might decide to get a little bit more specific with it and buy individual ones, but that really is actually still what I do to this day, although I use Clabber culture now. But up until I started using Clabber culture, I just had one mesophilic, one thermophilic in my freezer, and I use that for all sorts of different cheeses. Sorry, you guys got that really loud there. All right. So one thing of note for these freeze-dried starter cultures that you're going to buy online is that you have to be really clean with the technique that you use with these starter cultures because you're trying to give them the best opportunity to thrive in your milk. These cultures are usually comprised of only one or two different strains of lactic bacteria, so you add them into your milk and it's sort of a foreign environment. They don't really want to thrive, so you have to make it so that there's no competition, there's the best quality food for them so that they actually can thrive. So you want to be pretty clean, pretty sterile with those types of cheeses. And so as I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, I actually now use a starter culture called Clabber. We can just flip that. Perfect. So Clabber is like my passion food. I love this food so much. I could talk about it all day. I could do a whole presentation on it. But Clabber is basically the sourdough starter of cheese making. As I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, it's a raw milk starter culture. I feed it every day to keep it healthy, and I use it as a starter culture for all of the different cheeses that I make. So the one rule with this, keeping a Clabber culture, actually there's a few rules, but the one really big rule is to make sure that you're always using good quality raw milk. And then it also, a cool thing about it is that it contains both mesophilic and thermophilic cultures within it. So instead of having to go and buy all those different starter cultures, you actually have everything you need in this water bottle here. It traveled from Canada. You actually have everything you need in that starter culture. And it's your cheese-making technique, whether you heat your milk up to a higher temperature during the cheese-making process or whether you keep it at a lower temperature, that's actually going to dictate what types of bacteria are able to thrive in your cheese. So I'm going to show you guys how to keep our Clabber culture as well as how to feed it. So when you're in a starter Clabber culture, I don't have any pictures up there, I'm sorry. So I'll try and do it at the front here. So when you're going to start a Clabber culture, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to pour fresh milk into a jar. Now preferably this milk is going to be fresh and warm from the udder. But if you're getting milk from a milk share or something like that, it's okay if you use milk that has been refrigerated. I would recommend for your first ferment of it that you do heat it up to probably about between 80 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, just kind of mimicking that calf digestion again. So all you're going to do is you're going to pour that raw milk into a jar. I usually start with like a pint, and then you're going to put a loose lid on it. I like to use a coffee filter. And then you're going to leave it on the counter until it coagulates. Usually this takes about 3 or 4 days. And so this is kind of against everything for people. They're like, leave raw milk on the counter for 3 or 4 days, but that's what you got to do. You got to leave it there until it coagulates. So once it coagulates, what you're going to do is you're going to take a new clean pint jar. I need to use this jar here. And you're going to take a little bit of that Clabber culture. I'm going to use mine here. And I don't like to keep it in plastic. I like to keep it in glass, but it had to travel. Usually it's a nice coagulated, like it will look like yogurt, but it's gotten a little bit hot today. So you're going to put about a tablespoon of that into another jar, and then you're going to feed it new, fresh milk. And so pretend this had been my Clabber culture. Actually, this was my Clabber culture. So this is my discard. Just like if you have a sourdough starter, you have discard. This is my discard now. So I was going to stir that up, put it on your counter, loose lid, thing on it, and you're going to let that sit there for probably about 24 hours, and it's going to be coagulated. It will look just like yogurt. And then again, you're going to take another tablespoon of it, you're going to feed it new, fresh milk, and then you're going to let it sit on the counter. 24 hours later, you're going to have more. So you're going to continue this feed, ferment, discard process for as long as you want. It can last forever. I've had ones that have lasted probably about a year, but you can really keep them going for indefinitely, basically. We can switch the slide there. All right, so a lot of people ask me, I'm just going to fix this because it's bugging me. So a lot of people ask me, what do you do with the discard? So just like sourdough has that discard and you're able to use it in all sorts of different recipes, the discard for Clabber is the prize as well. Eventually, once you get it good for cheese making, and I'll talk about that in a second, you can use the discard as your cheese making starter culture. But you also always just have a lot hanging around the kitchen. I use it in everything. I use it in baking. I use it to thicken sauces. What else do I use it in? I use it as dressings. I feed it to my kids as yogurt. It becomes really nice and mild, and it doesn't, like you would think it would taste gross, but because you are feeding it every day, it tastes very nice. So I just use it in everything, and it's a really versatile product. You know, grandmas used to keep sour milk on their counters, and this is that sour milk. This is what grandmas were keeping on their counters. So very, very cool stuff. All right, so how much should I use to culture my cheese? So as I said, you can use it for any style of cheese that you're making. You're going to want to use the ratio of a 1/4 cup of Clabber culture, like coagulated Clabber culture, to a gallon of milk. So for example, if you're making a 2-gallon batch of cheese, you're going to be using a 1/2 cup of Clabber culture. if you are making a 4-gallon batch of cheese, you're going to be using 1 cup of Clabber culture. And when we do that master curd demo, I'll show you guys how to actually incorporate that into your milk. I guess I have this one too. All right, so can I keep it in the fridge? So just like your sourdough starter, sometimes you don't feel like feeding it every day, and so you move it to the fridge. And you can do the same thing with Clabber culture. The one rule is that you want to make sure that it's coagulated before you're putting it in the fridge. So if you don't feel like feeding it, put it in the fridge when it's coagulated, and then up to a week later, you can come back and you can pull it out. You can feed it to new fresh milk, allow it to coagulate on the counter, and then you can put it back in the fridge once it's coagulated. So it's nice and versatile like that. Can you keep it in the freezer? So I'm often asked this, and this is a great way. For example, right now at home, my cows are both dry. They're due to calve in the summer. So I have some Clabber culture sitting in my freezer. I just put it into ice cube trays, then pop the ice cubes out into a Ziploc bag. Then when you go to use it, you're just going to pop a couple of those ice cubes into a jar, allow them to thaw, and then top it with that milk. And it'll probably coagulate in about 24 hours because actually this stuff came from frozen Clabber, and it took 2 days to coagulate, but I had to feed it pasteurized milk, so it wasn't very happy with that. So it works really well in the freezer as well, and that's a great way to have kind of a backup bit in the freezer because you always worry that you might accidentally let it die. All right, there's a white mold skim on your Clabber. So if you've ever made kefir, or kefir, I never know how to say it, there's a white mold scum on top of that, and the same thing happens with Clabber. What that actually is a yeast called Geotrichum cadidum, which is very beneficial for cheese making, and it's actually a sign that your Clabber culture is pretty healthy and it's doing good. It's safe to consume, so you can just, if you don't actually want to consume it, you can dip down below it and get the Clabber underneath, or we just eat it. It's fine. If you have any other types of molds on there, though, if you have any black molds, blue molds, yellow molds, anything like that, I would toss that Clabber out. And that is why it is nice to have some in the fridge or in the freezer, just as a backup in case something like that happens. I never actually have had any other contaminating molds grow on my Clabber. So I help people troubleshoot Clabber not coagulating quite a bit, just because I'm kind of looking at cheese making as a natural process. The first place I go with people is back to the cow again. So if their cow has been on antibiotics or if she's recently been sick, I kind of let them know that they should probably focus on getting their cow healthy. So focus on mineral requirements, focus on maybe probiotics, because we are harnessing that good ecology within that raw milk. It just goes to show that, that if your cow's health is not well, it's probably not going to coagulate as well. Other things we talk about when we're coagulating, troubleshooting Clabber would be warmth. So just like that little calf stomach, warmth is king. You're always prioritizing warmth. So if you are making your Clabber with cold milk, you can warm it up to like 80 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. You can wrap it in a warm towel. Anything like that can kind of encourage it to get started. And then once you get it started, it's pretty good at just maintaining itself. I even feed my Clabber culture at home cold milk, and it still coagulates in 24 hours. Start with a smaller amount. So you don't have to start with a pint jar, and you don't have to continue with a pint jar. You can start with, maybe you're only making small batches of cheese. You can start with just a little bit, and then you're not going to have as much discard as well. Feed it with liquid milk. So if I couldn't have gotten my Clabber to coagulate, because I was worried that it might not coagulate, I still would have fed this to some new fresh raw milk, and it probably would have coagulated within 24 hours. Sometimes that just gives those bacteria a little extra food, a little extra boost to get going. And that's all my troubleshooting things for that. And then finally, there's bubbles in my Clabber culture, or you're seeing whey separation in your Clabber culture. So a perfect, beautiful, coagulated Clabber culture should not kind of look like this, but it should be just like yogurt. There shouldn't be any whey separation in there. There shouldn't be any bubbles in there. And what that's actually telling me is, I'm going to go into the science of it a little bit. So what we're trying to achieve with Clabber culture is the lactic bacteria that are present in the raw milk, we're trying to feed and foster them. So they're going to start to feed in that raw milk, and they're going to start to feed on that lactose and ferment it into that lactic acid. And once it's acidic enough, it's going to cause that milk to coagulate. Now, lactic bacteria are sort of like their own worst enemies. They come into milk and they feed on all the lactose, and they also create a really acidic environment. And they can't survive in an acidic environment. So not only is there no food, the environment is acidic, they start to die off. And what happens with this is now the stage has been set for that fungal fermentation to start. One of the funguses that we commonly deal with in cheesemaking is yeast. And we know from bread baking that yeast likes to create bubbles. So if you're seeing bubbles in your Clabber culture, it could be caused by bacteria, but it could also be caused by yeast. And now your lactic bacteria have started to die off, and they've set that stage for these yeasts to kind of come in and start to ferment. So when we're using Clabber culture for cheesemaking, we're always making sure that we're using newly coagulated Clabber that hasn't had a chance to separate, that hasn't had a chance to start to form bubbles, because that's how we know that those lactic bacteria are strong and they're ready to go on to start making cheese. All right. A little drink of water. So rennet is a catch-all phrase to describe a multitude of different enzymes that can be used to cause quick coagulation in milk. And we just learned in the Clabber section that acidification alone can cause coagulation in milk, but it takes a really long process. We're waiting 24 hours for our Clabber to coagulate. And because cheesemaking is so much of that stage setting, we want to start to be able to manipulate our milk a lot sooner than that. And one of the ways that we're able to do that is add in the rennet enzyme to cause coagulation. So coagulation with rennet happens in about an hour. You can add it into your pot, and an hour later you're going to have a full coagulated pot of curds. Now, you can get different types of rennet. You can buy them online at any cheese supply store. So the most common types are vegetable, animal, and microbial. Because I am trying to mimic that natural process of calf digestion, I like to use animal rennet, but they all work. I would say probably the only thing about them is that vegetable rennet, if you're using it to make aged cheeses that are over 4 months, it can often cause bitterness in your cheese. So making sure you're only using vegetable rennet for fresh cheeses. Also, junket rennet is sometimes sold, and it's not a good substitute for cheese making. It's too low of a dose. I have heard people going to use it in really high doses, but it's not going to work as well. So avoiding junket rennet and avoiding vegetable rennet if you're making aged cheeses. And so most rennet, it can come in liquid form or it can come in tablet form. Both of them work just as well. And yeah, I talked about that you can purchase it from any cheese supply website. So I often get, is it possible to harvest your own rennet? So it is possible. If anyone has ever read the book, The Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder, they harvested their own rennet, and you know how they did that. So most of us aren't actually going to be butchering a young calf specifically for rennet. If you are going to be harvesting rennet from a young animal, that animal has to have only been on milk, and usually you're taking it at about 2 weeks. So I can't see that I would ever actually be harvesting my own rennet on our ranch, but it's kind of an interesting skill to know about if everything hits the fan. And then other vegetables that can be used to coagulate milk would be figs, cardoons, nettles, what did I forget? Thistle are all options to coagulate milk. I have experimented with some of these, and I haven't had much luck. There's not a lot of information out there about coagulating milk with vegetables. I kind of think that it might be something that you're better off just doing acid coagulation. From what I've kind of experimented with, it takes a long time. You're not getting that quick coagulation with it. But because cheesemaking always keeps you learning, I could be standing up here 10 years from now explaining how to make vegetable rennet. So I don't know. But so far, it's just easiest to source it from the cheese supply store. All right. So salt is probably going to be the easiest thing that you can source. Salt is a referee in cheesemaking. It comes in, it starts to slow down the fermentation process, and is, again, one of those pieces of that stage setting. So when you source salt for cheesemaking, you're going to want to source salt that doesn't have any additives in it. So it should be just fine ground salt on the label. No iodine, no anti-clumping agents, because those are all going to interrupt with your bacterial fermentation. I'm in Canada, I'm able to find it in the canning aisle, and I actually went to Target to get some cheesemaking equipment when I got here, and you guys have it at Target, and it wasn't even in the canning aisle, so you can find it at your local stores. All right, so now we're going to dive into the master curd demo. So as I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, this master curd demo really is that mimicking of calf digestion, and it's also how all of the different cheese recipes that I make start. So they start with this 4 main steps. We can switch this here, sorry. They start with these 4 steps of warming the milk up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, adding in our bacterial starter culture, adding in that rennet, and then allowing that milk to coagulate. So I'm going to go through each step with you guys and talk a little bit of troubleshooting. So we can switch. Oh, good. Perfect. All right. So I didn't plug in my hot plate today, but I'm just going to kind of demonstrate to you guys. So the first step is you're going to warm your milk up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're going to pretend that I did that today. So when you warm your milk up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, I mean, this is pretty simple. You can figure it out, but I just do it over medium heat. Usually I'm making really big batches of cheese at home, so this actually takes me quite a while. Usually I wash my milking dishes, I do a little bit of things. I'm just coming back every once in a while to stir this pot while it's heating up. Oh, there's me. Oh. All right. Oh, I guess I don't really need that. Okay. Just on the first slide back there, I just had a troubleshooting thing. If you accidentally heat it up too high, that's not a problem. Just you can either gradually cool it down, or you can fill your sink full of cold water, put the whole pot in there, and just stir it, and that will rapidly cool it down. So it's not a problem at this stage if you accidentally go too high. And different recipes, so all of my recipes heat the milk up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but different recipes will have you heat the milk to different temperatures. And if you're following those recipes, you should probably go along with what they say. All right, so our step 2, which we're at now, is to add in your starter culture. So as I talked about, you can either choose to add in a freeze-dried starter culture, or you can choose to add in a well-fed Clabber culture. And so when I talk about that well-fed, that it's coagulated, and I usually wait probably about 4 feedings after I have started my Clabber culture from scratch to use it in cheese making. And that's just gonna, again, ensure that those lactic bacteria are good and ready to go. So if I was gonna add my freeze-dried starter culture into my pot, all you're gonna do, and I won't even show you because I'm gonna add the Clabber one in there, but it's just like a powder. Oh, I don't know if you guys can see this. So it's just like a powder. And all you're going to do when you put it into your milk is you're going to sprinkle it as evenly as possible as you can over the surface of the milk. Sometimes you get a little heavy-handed and there's some clumps and stuff there. That's not a big deal, but those areas aren't going to do as well. So after you add your freeze-dried starter culture into your milk, you need to wait 5 minutes before you come back and stir it in. And this is just a time when it is able to rehydrate. So it's going to look like a powder on top of there. When you come back 5 minutes later, it's going to look like sort of like a grease stain, and that's how you know that it has rehydrated enough. Now, if you decide that you're not going to use freeze-dried culture and you are going to use your Clabber culture, how you're going to incorporate it into your milk is you're actually going to take a little bit of milk. Oh, I've got milk here. We're going to pretend this is just milk from that pot. I just dipped that out of that pot. You're going to take your Clabber culture and you're going to whisk it. It's really gross having it in a bottle. I don't recommend that. All right. You're going to whisk it in there. Again, 1/4 cup of Clabber per gallon of milk. You're going to whisk it to make sure there's no lumps. And then you can add it into your cheese pot. And anytime you are adding anything into your cheese pot, I always like to use kind of an up and down stirring motion to incorporate it in. And so this is just a technique that you're going to use for any time you add anything into the cheese pot. All right, so after you've added your culture in, where are we at now? Oh, it's still me again. All right, you're going to add in your rennet. So there is one really important rule when you're adding rennet into anything and into any cheese pot is that you have to dilute it. Doesn't matter what kind it is, doesn't matter what form it is, you have to dilute it. Oops. And the reason for that is that rennet starts working the instant that it comes in contact with milk. So if you don't dilute it, you're not going to be able to disperse it throughout the entire pot. So when you add your rennet into your dilution water, usually that water is going to be about the same temperature as your cheese pot. Usually recipes will say like lukewarm, but yeah, I just go kind of dip my finger in there and see what the temperature is. All right, so when you incorporate it into your water, oops, sorry, I should have done that there. You're just going to stir it up like that. You want to do it right before you knead it. And so different rennets are going to have different strengths. There's double strength, there's single strength. So I always recommend to people that you actually go on the package directions of your rennet rather than the recipe directions. And you can kind of work with this later on, but that's what I recommend when you're just getting started, just so that you know that you're going to be adding in the right amount of rennet. I just added liquid rennet in here, but if you're using tablet rennet, I like to crush it with the back of a spoon just because it takes forever for the tablets to dilute, and you really do want to be mixing this up right before you need it. So when you add it into your cheese pot, as I said, it is going to start working quite quickly, so you're going to do that up and down stirring motion. And then what I like to do is I like to turn my spoon just kind of sideways like this, and this is going to stop the milk from moving. Because if the milk is still moving when it starts to coagulate, you're going to get a really swirly design in your coagulated curd mass. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in tomorrow's presentation. All right, so I would take my spoon out, and now I would put the lid on my pot. We're on step 4 now. Now we're going to put the lid on our pot, and you're going to allow it to sit and coagulate for usually about 1 hour, as the recipes call for. I just want to make sure when I talked about rennet that I talked all the troubleshooting points I had on that thing. Oh yeah, okay. Sorry, back to rennet for a minute. So if you do forget to dilute your rennet, you can just pivot to a fresh cheese. That would be what I would do. Sometimes this does happen. You do forget to dilute it, and you might just want to go on to make like a ricotta or any types of fresh cheeses that you're not going to be aging, because too much rennet in cheese can actually cause bitterness. So if you are needing to add a double dose, you're not really sure how much is actually gotten in there. All right. Perfect. So where are we at now? We can move on. Perfect. So starting all of my cheeses the same way, it really helps me to incorporate cheese making better into my life on the homestead. Oftentimes, I don't actually know which type of cheese I'm going to be making until I get to this 4th step of putting my lid on my pot and allowing it to sit for that hour. During that hour, I go off and I do other things on the homestead. I go to the garden, I do loads of laundry, and I kind of see where that day is going to go. And then I come back and I know, oh, I have time to stand here and stir for 45 minutes. Oh, no, I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to make a quick type of cheese. And the best thing you can do for your cheese making is to kind of just start. And the more you start, the more you do, you're going to kind of start to see what cheeses do fit into your life better on those days that are busy, on those days that aren't as busy, and you're going to find your homestead cheeses that really work for your life. All right. So that's it, folks. Thank you guys so much for attending this presentation. I just feel really honored to be here. You can follow along with me at Cheese From Scratch on Instagram. I'm quite active there. I also have quite a few resources on my website. So I have a blog, I have a course, I have a monthly membership called the Milkmaid Society, where I create content as well as I hire other milkmaids and milkmen every month to create content on all things dairy, cheese making, goats, milk cows, all sorts of things like that. And I also have a book coming out. It's set to release in spring 2025 with the publishing company Homestead Living. That actually, I believe they have a tent here this weekend, so you can stop by there and say hi.